Empires don't fall with explosions, they fall with balance sheets. And Britain didn't lose its empire to rebels or ideals, it lost it to numbers that stopped adding up. This is the story of how the richest empire in history made a financial mistake so large, it quietly handed global power to someone else. And here's the uncomfortable part. That mistake is happening again. At its peak, Britain didn't just control land, it controlled money. For more than a century, the pound wasn't just currency, it was trust. If you traded globally, you settled in pounds. If you borrowed in pounds. If a crisis hit anywhere in the world, London was the center of gravity. That financial dominance was the real empire. But empires don't die when they lose battles. They die when they lose credibility, and Britain's credibility cracked long before the public noticed. Here's where the real story begins. After World War I, Britain technically won. But financially, it was bleeding. The war cost Britain more than it could afford, not just in money, but in structure. To fight, Britain sold off overseas assets. Gold reserves drained, foreign investments vanished. And for the first time, Britain owed massive debts, mostly to the United States. That was the first quiet shift of power. America didn't conquer Britain. Britain borrowed from America. Still, Britain tried to pretend nothing had changed. It clung to its empire because the empire paid the bills. Colonies weren't just about pride. They generated cash, trade routes, and tax revenue. Lose the empire, and the system collapses. So Britain made a decision that would haunt it for decades. In the 1920s, it forced the pound back to its old gold standard value. The message was simple. We are still the same superpower. But the economy underneath was weaker. Exports became expensive. Industry suffered. Unemployment rose. Britain chose image over reality. That's the first mistake. And then came the Second War. World War II didn't just cost Britain blood. It cost Britain everything. To survive, Britain sold more assets, more gold, more overseas holdings. By the end of the war, Britain wasn't just weakened, it was financially hollow. The empire still existed on maps, but the money that powered it was gone. And that's when the United States stepped in, not as a conqueror, as a banker. Through programs like Lend-Lease, America supplied Britain with weapons, fuel, food, everything needed to survive. But nothing was free. By 1945, the global system had changed forever. The dollar replaced the pound as the world's reserve currency. Global trade shifted. Capital flowed through New York instead of London. Britain didn't lose the empire overnight. It lost the financial engine that made the empire possible. And now the trap closed. Britain still had global commitments, military bases, colonies, defense obligations, but no longer had the money to sustain them. Imagine a credit card lifestyle. After the income disappears, that's exactly what Britain faced. To keep the system alive, Britain borrowed. Again, and again, and again. Each loan came with less freedom. By the 1950s, Britain looked powerful on the surface, but behind closed doors, every major decision depended on Washington. Then came the moment of humiliation, the Suez Crisis. Britain tried to act like a superpower one last time, militarily intervening to protect its interests. But the United States said no, and Britain had no choice but to listen. Why? Because America controlled Britain's access to dollars, and without dollars, Britain's economy would collapse. That single moment revealed the truth to the world. The empire wasn't sovereign anymore. From there, the unraveling accelerated. The pound came under pressure. Confidence faded. Capital fled. By the late 1960s, the pound collapsed, devalued, weakened, no longer trusted. And in 1976, the unthinkable happened. Britain went to the International Monetary Fund, begging for a bailout. The empire that once financed the world was now asking for help. That wasn't just an economic failure, it was a psychological one. Britain didn't fall because it lacked courage. It fell because it tried to maintain global dominance without the financial foundation to support it. Here's the most important lesson. Empires don't fall when they spend too much. They fall when spending no longer produces growth. Britain kept paying for a global role it could no longer afford. And the bill came due. But this story doesn't end in the past, because the same warning signs are flashing again. Bigger numbers, bigger debts, bigger promises. And this time, the empire at risk isn't Britain. I'll show you the $35 trillion mistake, why it mirrors Britain's collapse almost perfectly, and why history might be closer to repeating itself than anyone wants to admit. History never repeats itself the same way, but it always rhymes. And if Britain's empire collapsed because money ran out, what happens when the world's largest economy reaches the same point? This is where the story becomes dangerous. After Britain fell, the United States didn't just replace it. America redesigned the entire financial world. The dollar became the center. Global trade, oil, debt, reserves, all priced in dollars. America didn't need colonies. It had currency power. For decades, this worked flawlessly. America could borrow cheaply, print money in crises, run deficits without punishment, because the world needed dollars. But here's the rule of economic history most people ignore. Reserve currency status is not permanent. It's rented, and rent is paid through discipline. This is where Britain failed, and this is where America is now standing. Let's talk about the number no one wants to say out loud. Over $35 trillion in national debt. That number isn't just large, it's abstract. It doesn't feel real, so let's make it real. America now spends more on interest payments than on its military, more than on education, more than on infrastructure. Interest, not investment. That's the same phase Britain entered in the 1950s, when debt stops funding growth and starts funding survival. For years, this wasn't a problem. Why? Because interest rates were low, and global confidence in the dollar was absolute. But confidence is fragile. The moment inflation surged, the rules changed. Higher rates meant higher interest costs. Suddenly, debt wasn't cheap anymore, and just like Britain, America faced an impossible triangle. Cut spending, risk social and political unrest, raise taxes, risk economic slowdown, print money, risk inflation, and currency trust. There is no painless option. Britain tried all three, and failed at all three. Now look at the parallels. Britain maintained global military commitments it could no longer afford. America maintains hundreds of bases worldwide. Britain relied on debt to preserve status. America relies on debt to preserve lifestyle. Britain assumed its currency dominance was permanent. America assumes the same, but dominance ends the moment alternatives appear. And they are appearing. Trade deals bypassing the dollar. Central banks diversifying reserves. Energy transactions settling in other currencies. Not replacing the dollar overnight, but slowly reducing dependence. That's exactly how the pound lost status. Not with collapse, with erosion. Here's the most uncomfortable truth. Britain didn't notice the collapse while it was happening. Life felt normal. Markets still functioned. The flag still flew. Until one day, the choices were gone. That's how financial decline works. Not dramatic, gradual. The real danger isn't bankruptcy. It's loss of flexibility. When Britain needed to act independently, it couldn't. Every decision required approval from creditors. That's what ended the empire. And today, America is closer to that line than most people realize. If interest costs keep rising, if confidence weakens, if growth can't outpace debt, then history doesn't need war. It doesn't need rebellion. It just needs arithmetic. This is why Britain's mistake matters. Not because empires always fall, but because they fall the same way. By ignoring financial reality until reality enforces discipline. Britain assumed it could borrow forever. It couldn't. America assumes it can manage forever. Maybe it can. But economic history is unforgiving. The lesson is simple, brutal, and timeless. No nation, no matter how powerful, can spend beyond its productive capacity indefinitely. Not Britain, not America. The collapse doesn't announce itself. It whispers. Through bond yields, through deficits, through confidence slowly leaking away. Britain learned that too late. The question now isn't whether America will collapse tomorrow. It's whether anyone is willing to learn from the last empire that thought it was immune. Because once the money runs out, power follows, and history moves on.